This is Counterpoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granick-Ellen. Are you ready to say goodbye to 2024 and all that happened this past year? Well, before you jump into 2025, here on Counterpoint, we're going to review some of the stories which grabbed the headlines this past year. Stories which shocked, surprised, comforted, and made us cry. And joining me to go through the news is David Clement, news director here at the News Forum, who's joining me in studio here. Sorry about that. I messed up your title.
That is
Should
okay.
be a great interview.
There we go.
Anyhow, so David, you have an excellent role here at the News Forum, as you
Mhm.
really are in the hot seat where you take in so much of the daily news, distill it for us, for the viewers back home. What were some of the larger things or larger themes that kind of came through this year?
I think one big one that jumps right out is foreign interference, because we're still very much in the throes of trying to parse through what we know, what we don't know. There were obviously very damning allegations from the Trudeau government against the Indian government, implying that they were allegedly involved in the murder of a Sikh independence activist in BC. So we're talking about two very powerful countries, two, generally speaking,
Hmm.
allies economically and geopolitically, now accusing each other in certain instances, one on one side of allegedly murdering a Canadian citizen here in Canada, the other of, obviously, the Indians are saying that they didn't and they were not involved, and accuse Canada of harboring terrorists and being weak on terror. So that would be a huge one. And that all happens within the backdrop of Ottawa reviewing Chinese interference.
Right, and that was a huge, and still continues to be a huge dominant
Mhm.
story this year, and it'll continue probably for several years.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's going to continue at least through the election. It seems to be a rather popular talking point from the Liberals in terms of Pierre Poilievre and questions about security clearance. There are still things we don't know about whom in the report was allegedly either witting or unwittingly participating in instances of foreign interference. If those individuals are members of parliament or the Senate or former members of parliament. So there's a lot that's still unknown that I think is going to get drawn out over the next 6 months or so.
Oh, absolutely. And that's definitely an onion I'd like to see peeled, especially as it involves interference in our democratic process.
Mhm.
To hear and read or hear suggested that China was interfering in the very grassroots level of election nominations in the federal election.
Mhm.
I mean, this is shocking. We were so consumed with what has been happening south of the border in the last 8 years,
Yep.
discussing foreign interference there and seeing the big uh, debated mess of whether those elections were true or not, things like this. But to know that that's happening here is very jarring for Canadians.
Yeah, especially in nomination contests for political parties, because as it stands, you don't have to be a citizen to vote in those nomination
Hmm.
contests. It doesn't appear as though the parties are going to change those rules. And so that process is still ripe for abuse, mismanagement, interference, corruption, etc. So that's one of the big questions that's almost left unanswered, I would say, from all of this, is everybody can see at least one point where there's a problem, but has not been any action yet.
And then there were some MPs, and we sort of glossed on this, but who had been targeted,
Hmm.
had threats issued against
Hmm.
them. Some very covert threats, some a little more overt against them, their family.
Hmm.
We want our parliamentarians to continue to represent their democratic elected, to be those symbols of democracy. But how does a parliamentary do that if they're going to be interfered with on a personal level by a foreign country?
How do they do that? And how do they continue to do their job if the perception is that Ottawa or the law enforcement bodies involved are not taking this seriously or acting promptly enough? So Michael Chong is a very prominent
Hmm.
example, where he said that his family was targeted because he's a very vocal opponent of the Chinese Communist Party. Um, Difficult to have people in Parliament continue to do their job and continue to defend the interests of Canadians if at the same time we know their family members are targeted, and if we're seen to be relatively lax in terms of our
Right.
response from a criminal justice point forward.
Absolutely. Well, this definitely will feature in the election. I'm pretty certain of that. We'll be right back in just a few moments.